few seconds. All right, so we're live. All right. Hey, everybody, this is John from AEPAC Mule. Thank you for coming. Thank you for bearing with me while we go through the different audio-visual adjustments. Lots of change since I've gone on a live stream with OBS and YouTube. So we're going to do StreamYards today, and I do apologize for what happened earlier. But I do want to welcome and wish everybody a happy 4th of July to everybody. And my special guest, of course, Halisha, is someone that I used to work with a couple hundred years ago. And we're going to talk about race relations, what we can do to make things better, and how to celebrate 4th of July in a meaningful way. And I hope that we learned something from each other today. Halisha, I know it's been a long time since we've actually talked, so hopefully we can talk with some real special information for our guest.
Yes. Where would you like to start?
I would like to start by saying thank you very much for coming on. A lot of times people are so polarized with this subject that they can't intellectually have a meaningful conversation. So that's one of the reasons why I invited you, because I knew that you would approach this in a very meaningful way, in an intelligent way. And when we left the conversation, we would have something that we can do. So I do appreciate you coming on. First of all, let's start with, how are you dealing with this last 3 months as far as, first of all, we've had the quarantine, the pressure, and then George Floyd lost his life, murdered right in front of our eyes. And that had to be very impactful, especially considering the amount of pressure we've already had from other deaths. I just can't imagine what that would be like for you.
Well, and I want to say thank you for having me. I appreciate this conversation, and I plan to walk away changed, and also let's just talk it out. I think in the last, with learning about George Floyd's murder, and I remember even, hearing about the murder, and still it not necessarily gravitating where I'm like, how big. I had no idea that it would become this polarized in terms of the amount of protest that has now happened. And I think when you think about the pandemic, learning that Black folks are dying at disproportionate rates it wasn't helpful to learn about that. And I think right before learning about George Floyd, we had learned about Ahmaud Arbery, and we had, a few days after that, had learned about Breonna Taylor, the no-knock warrant. So I think I was ready to hear about more, but certainly not as closely as it came. So I think it definitely made the impact that much more great, because we've all been in the house and you're thinking, how did the police still find time, and how did it become so out of hand that was the outcome?
Yeah, I can't imagine, like I said, all of those names that you mentioned are people's lives. They're not just names. And it's so important to realize that this is not just about George Floyd. The list literally goes on and on and on and on. And it's not enough to say, yes, these people were fired, or these people were suspended, or these people were, had to do some jail time, whatever. It's like a systematic killing of human beings. And it's so frustrating, because I don't feel like, as a person who is, obviously white and doesn't realize what most people have to go through in their regular life, as a person of color that is systematically destroyed. And it's hard for me to understand that. And I don't know if you can explain it in a way that would make it easier for me to understand.
You know, even as you say the word understanding, and I think that as we've learned, right, throughout our lifetime, um, and I'm feeling where understanding is not necessarily, I think, where I am focused on, because I don't, I think the fact that you don't live it makes that much more of an impact, right? Like you'll never know the feeling. You may observe and see. I don't believe that, when people talk about being economically challenged or poor, right? Like I don't believe that we have to all be poor in order to know that we don't want to be poor. And I think from a humanity perspective, Black folks have been dehumanized for so many years, right? So, there's that feeling that we're not seen as human, and if we are seen as like um, as a service, right, and not as someone with equity. So I don't know if it's about understanding versus just challenging the way you've been taught. And I know I've talked to a lot of my, well-intentioned white friends who say they didn't have or they didn't see racism in their homes. And I would challenge that if you went to public school, if you went to public places, while you may not have recognized it, it was there. And I don't know that we have to find it to know that it existed. And I feel like a lot too. I don't know, John, if you've heard about, people have kind of likened the Me Too movement in terms of when that movement gained such momentum. A lot of the talk was not are just believing the women and the men who came forward, and not necessarily needing to vet their experience, but to hear it. And certainly investigations would take place, but in terms of having to having to show you how hard it's been, I don't know that that's necessary in order for us to move forward. Um, and I think what you're seeing now is more people are feeling a lot more comfortable to talk about their experiences. And I'm hoping it's not from a perspective for it to be believed that it was actually racism, because there's so much streaming around that. But just the fact of letting and healing themselves by talking about what they've experienced, if they feel comfortable enough. Um, but I'd be curious for you, if while you were, as you have, because we talk about the system, but obviously there's individuals that are involved in that process. How do you see where someone like yourself can be of a help, or what have you been challenged with or thinking about?
Yeah, I think the support for um, any kind of civil liberties is always there, has always been there for me. I've never been afraid to reach out to anybody because I never see anybody of color. I've always been able to do that. And I think it has a lot to do with my upbringing. I grew up where about 50% of the people were either Spanish or Black. Um, I, I grew up in South Florida and Central Florida before I moved here in 1998. So the one thing that caused me to go like more understanding than anything else was opening up a chest that my grandfather. Um, sorry, uh, he had a KKK cape in his closet with a white rose, so I knew more. He didn't just enter into the program, you know what I mean? So it was very hard for me to even associate myself with him. So I always knew that there was racial injustice from day one. I didn't have to go very far. But when it came to me personally, I always, like I said, I never had any issues with inviting someone to my house, or obviously, if you look at my YouTube channel, you'll see that I have probably just as many people of color or ethnic. Doesn't matter whether they're men or women or black or white. I don't care. They're always welcome to my channel. So yeah,
And
I just don't know what to do next, I guess, is my biggest issue in regards to your question.
well, and like I said, I think more about as the days have gone on and the protests have extended. I think I go back to, and I know a lot of us will feel like we have to change people's minds, and I'm not so sure that that's a necessary step, because if someone's not open to it, it won't matter. I think where I'm more focused on is challenging people, which is not new to me, but also I'm feeling inspired that there are more folks like yourself and like many others who are also being challenged right now in figuring out where and how they intersect, right, with racism and what they've either experienced or have witnessed. Um, I think about when we talk about now the police with the and excuse me if I jump all over the place. So if you need
No, it's okay.
something, tell me. But when you think about the police and how folks are talking good police, bad police, and I think, right, if they're really, what comes to my mind is, when did the protection and serving stop, or was it always never intended for someone who looked like me, right? And was and we know now, with looking back at police and how they even started, a lot of that was based on slave patrols, right? And restoring order. Um, and I think now where we are, where we're starting to find out, even on this very day of February 4th, 1776, and to now learn, or not to now, but I think more people are paying attention to the fact that there were still enslaved people. And so, how can we celebrate this Independence Day as independence when there were so many folks that were not afforded that same experience? And it took 89 more years before things actually did, where slavery became abolished, and then another 2 years before Texas found out. So there's all these connecting of the dots, and I don't know that we necessarily have to go back to slavery days, but I do think it does lend to where we are today. And even Civil Rights Act, right, of 64, or there was the voting rights, and then 65, where there was things out of civil rights that came, which was like the ADA, right? Disabled Act came out of that. In addition to that, Title IX came out of that, where we've seen white women, you know, uh, gaining employment. So even if you go back to like 1870, I think is when black men were allowed to vote. And if you look at when they came out, that number was high. Like, black men were like, "We're here."
Yeah.
And there were times where they were told they had to count jelly beans, right, to come in to vote. They were tested, and reading and writing wasn't something that black folks were afforded.
Or they would restrict them to say, you can't vote unless your father voted. It's like, come on, man. How are you going to fix that? And they did it intentionally.
Yeah, so the
But
suppression has been throughout, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure. I, I have a feeling that our audience is pretty well informed as far as that's concerned. Um, I really want to find out from you what you think we can do from here in regards to influencing our elected officials or our police chiefs or whatever to make the next step. Because, like you said, the whole reason the police department, we already know, was started was to recover slaves, to brutalize people, to make them not do that again, as far as escaping and that sort of thing. And I think that, I mean, if you look at it in Seattle, where we both worked, the Department of Justice really had to shut them down quite a bit because they were brutal and they were unfortunately um, not following federal guidelines on law enforcement. And so they were sanctioned. And I think that has to happen throughout the country. You know what I mean? I don't think that's something that can be just local because police move all the time. They change departments all the time. And I'm not saying that cops are all cops are bad, but what I am saying is that all cops are being taught bad. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think just with the history, right? Like if we really took a look at all the things we've learned, we would find that very little we probably want to carry forward, but because of what we're used to and what we have been exposed to, that holds and roots, right? I think police officers, because we have that conversation with, even with the protests, right? When they started back at the end of May, I think 29th was like that first day. And I don't think anyone imagined that it would still be even now, right, to this day. And I think that notion of where, and I'm sure you may have had a conversation where it was like, I believe in protesting, and I don't think the looting and this and that shouldn't happen. And then we found out that a lot of the groups that were embedded in white supremacy were the ones who were actually responsible for a lot of that looting and a lot of the damage to property. Yet, because of the focus of being Black Lives Matter, that became the precipice of like, well, if they weren't out there, then that wouldn't be the case. And then there's the conundrum of like, well, no one would be out there if there was no reason to. So there's so you can't ignore that there's not a reason and that it's not valid. And I think where people are getting kind of jammed up is, we're having the conversations about whether or not a person is good or bad. We are also in that way of they're really a nice person. And I don't necessarily know that someone needs to be nice in order to be decent, right? In order to be human. And we've kind of morphed those two things together and they don't necessarily go together in that regard, right? Like you could think of being decent doesn't necessarily mean you have to be the most pleasant person in the world, but then that means I'm not going to push you down on the ground when I decide that you're in my way, right? So I don't know. I think going forward, there's so folks are starting to pay attention more, and I wonder because we are home, and hopefully our memory muscle will hold on to that, the momentum of keeping that. People will continue to push themselves and educate themselves on plethora. Like, even thinking about it, John, folks have said, I didn't learn this in history class, right? And I don't even think 1 hour a day would have worked because we're now seeing, you know, even looking back at Black inventors, we wouldn't have the stoplight without a Black inventor. We wouldn't have a cell phone without a Black inventor. We wouldn't have the super soaker gun that everyone enjoys in the summer. Uh, so there's so many intersections of where Black invention, where we are embedded in the fabric of this country in such brutal ways, yet many people are still hopeful that things will change because there are more folks like yourself who are saying, what can I do different that I haven't been doing? And I don't know that there can be a blanket statement in the way you asked me. And I know I took a long time to come around
No,
here,
no, it's okay.
but I don't know that I can say to someone, this is what you should do, because it has to be sustainable for yourself. And if I tell you every day read an hour of history, you'll go, okay. And then you'll be like, well, what is the point of this? And so I think being more intentional about where we spend our time, and again, challenging those folks who are still deeply embedded, like you speak about your grandfather, and the, I question like the white rage that people talk about, and what the rage is. I don't know that I quite understand that myself. So maybe you can even help me with that. But
Tell me what you mean.
so I know that there's the idea that, they talk, so, the country being so embedded in violence. And I know there's a lot of talk about white males being upset and angry about things. What are they angry about? As they are, on the hierarchy, right? Of like the top tier anyway, or at least that's what is taught. So I wonder what the anger is.
That's a really interesting question because I'm like the most laid back person in the world. So I don't really have anything to be angry about other than, not being able to be with other people from the quarantine. That's about the only thing I can think of. And I'm not really that over upset there, but um, especially with, having YouTube and being able to connect with so many people through Zoom and meetings and Skype and all that other stuff. But angry white men, I really don't. I yeah, I really don't know. I'm not very helpful there. I'm sorry.
Well, and maybe
Are
that's,
you talking about like a male version of a Karen?
well, I know that there, maybe. I mean, I don't know if you've seen, there's a video circulating that I just saw in the last couple days where a lot of this conversations are around the mask wearing, right? And there was a white man in somewhere in California, and they had asked him to put his mask on. And he like, I'm sick, don't come close to me, and I'm 6 feet away, and I don't have to do both. It's one or the other, because there's a confusion about the distance and the mask wearing. And he was so incensed. He's yelling. They told him they weren't going to serve him, and yet they still rang him up. He still bought his stuff, but throughout still getting what he wanted, he was just unleashing on so many people, and people were recording him, and he was just like, I don't care, and he's cussing people out. And so maybe in that regard.
I think I if you're talking about stuff like that, I definitely think that is just men, especially men that have not been told what to do, whether it be by their parents, their boss, their whatever, have a really hard time understanding that what I'm doing is for the greater good, regardless of what I'm being told to do, like speeding, something simple as that. You're just not going to find people that obey the speeding laws because they don't have to, right? So I think when you're actually being told to do something very specific and very obvious, like starting on Tuesday in Washington, if you don't wear a mask, you don't get served, period. They're not going to, and if you can actually be fined as a business if you wait on somebody that's not wearing a mask. So I think that's going to happen a lot more after that because we've already had people at our Capitol with guns, with no mask, screaming at the governor restricting our movement. And it's like I don't understand why it's so hard to understand that if you have a flu type of a pandemic, why you would want to go around and expose yourself to other people. it's just a common sense kind of a thing. But I think what we're what I'm trying to get across to most of the people in the audience and the people that are listening, who are awesome, by the way. I probably don't nothing that they could probably basically share more with me than I can with them. But um, yeah, I don't think that wearing mask and being nice to someone is that hard to do. You know, I just don't understand why that's so complicated. Um, we're all different, so it doesn't matter what our differences are. It doesn't matter whether we're men, women, gay or straight. It doesn't matter. We're all human beings.
And that's when you said, right when you said the guns, I was thinking like what, like just your perspective on watching, particularly right in, was it Michigan, where the folks just got in their cars, they jammed up traffic, they stood on the steps of the capitals around, and with locked and loaded, um, no mask wearing. The governor of that state is a white woman who's holding the toe of saying, "Listen, right? People are getting sick because they had a, like, I think, a spike, and so they were like, come on, stay home." And they were upset because I think some of the restrictions they felt went overboard, and but yet it's like we didn't know. Like there's still no way to know, right? So I've seen a lot of folks now compare the pandemic to, I guess, for white folks, what it feels in relation to being limited to movement. I'm sure you've heard that, and I guess trying to draw like I don't know if we can draw a parallel, but at least try and draw a connection for folks to say, okay, the fact that you feel limited is a lot of how we as Black folks have been kind of stifled, right, and stymied. I think of when we work together. Think about, you know, think about more than 10 years ago. Of in that environment, it was pretty diverse. I thought.
Oh, it's probably the most diverse, awesome situation I've ever worked in.
Yeah.
Yeah, we worked in a call center for a large corporation, and there's probably what 3 or 4 floors of people that were mixed with teams that had everything that you can imagine as far as human beings, except for minors. Um, there were people that were 60, 70 years old.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
right out of high school, they didn't care. As long as you could breathe, they would hire you.
And and I think also when you think about the history of that, right? People had started at a young age and then they kind of stayed around for retirement, which we now know how that has morphed. But when you think about diverse places, and you even brought out age, which I hadn't even thought about. I'm like, yeah, there was such a variety of folks, and there was, we were all there to work, and I'm sure we all had a lot of fun. We know there were lots of things that took place in that mix, but the fact that there was so much to draw from, it was not just kind of a one way or one sided. I think in that regard. And I think, as we are talking about now, right, where I think there's for even for you, I would say, I think for a long time, Black folks have tried to live in that respectability. If we do and we conform and we don't challenge and we just kind of are there, people are more comfortable with that. And I think now that I think for a long time we've had to challenge and challenge and challenge. And I think now, even for yourself, for your people who are watching, like if you identify as a white person, you now can challenge other people. And I think even when we think about the current administration of the person who's inhibiting the White House right now, I have talked to a lot of folks now that have been so careful to not talk to their parents over the last few years about this presidency and the racism that has existed even since he's been in. But being able to really just challenge the people, the places that you feel most comfortable would be my advice. Where if you're a person, if you are in a space where you can decide what besides yourself, anybody else, what they're going to eat for dinner. What are we going to have for dinner? I don't know. Let's have this. Let's have that. Let's order this. If you are in a place where you can make those determinations and decisions for more than yourself of what you're going to have for dinner, that's where I think you should start. Where a lot of folks should start, where they have those conversations that say, I noticed you had this thought about this group of people. What is that rooted in? Where does that come from? Because I think I've heard stories now where people have said, well, I was watching something the other day and they were relaying a message from a white male who said he had been mad at black folks. He was, I think, in his 60s. And from being a child, he remembered playing with some kids in the street. One of the boys was a black boy who had the ball. He took his ball and he went home. And that white man now in his 60s was saying he was upset since then. And I don't know what, obviously along the way he had more experience, but in that moment, something triggered in him that made him say, I'm no longer going to talk to that group of people, or at least be kind, or at least be decent. And so,
I can't hang on to anything that long.
Right? So, and you think about that story where it's like, why didn't he just go to his house and ask him to come back outside? Like, what, maybe it was just the day. I don't know. But I think that's where I would challenge people. Go, the places you feel most comfortable are the places I think is where the cracks are, where you can fill in those gaps. It says, I noticed you have, and I think a lot of times too with white folks in particular, because it's your family and that's your group, that's your people, right? And so you know them from a different perspective than I would. And then if I come into that setting and people are shifty and feeling a little uncomfortable, that's where I think your help is needed, where you go, hey grandma, or hey whoever it is, why is it that when my friend came around or when we talked about this, you seemed uncomfortable, you made some comments that were unsavory. I'm learning that through my friends that they have not challenged those thoughts. They have learned since then that that's not how they think. But in terms of challenging that thought, not to change the mind, but to challenge, I think is where we really do ourselves a better service. Because if I'm trying to change your mind, John, about what you plan to eat for lunch today, and you're like, listen, I've been thinking about this all week, and you're like, come on, that's not
You're
what
not
you
going to tell me what to do.
Yeah, you're not the boss of me, right? Like we start getting into those conversations and you're like, look, you're at an age where you can decide, who am I? I don't have to cook it, right? So I think just being able to have to challenge yourself and challenge the others around you and saying, that's not okay. And to figure out why it's not okay. Because by the time they get to me, hopefully you will have challenged them and they will say, this is not what I should do. And then my interaction with them will be a little lighter. And I can go walk away thinking, okay.
Yeah, we have Amanda in the chat. She's saying that she checks her father every once in a while. And I know that he's an older gentleman like myself, who've been around so long that racism was probably encouraged back then, where some families would not let you hang out with anybody if they weren't waspy, and that I can see where, you have to be a little bit more conscious of, am I going to let that influence me? Because, yeah, it can
And
easily get away from me.
and I would say to Amanda, the fact that I would imagine for Amanda, and she can hopefully tell you, it probably has gotten not necessarily easier, and to have to say, oh, not that, but hopefully it's new things that are cropping up and not the same topic, or at least there's some connection to other areas of her father's life that you know she's able to impact. Um, and like you said, to hold on to anger or to hold on to, even when we think about the systems out there where you think about homeless in Seattle, I worked with for a few years. And even in that environment and setting, there was still racism because
Oh, sure.
there was just a lot of people, I think, want to argue that it's class, which I think it can have some regard, but it does not, it can't be the whole thing. And I think right now I'm also learning, right, where when white folks want to talk about race, they are kind of patted on the back and saying, "Wow, thank you, John, for bringing that up." And it's like,
Right.
if you, in the fact that you don't have to be in the environment, you can turn off the TV, you can turn off your phone, you go home and you don't have anyone sitting there like me who's saying, "Okay, John, what did you do today to dismantle racism?" So it really comes to when and I've we've learned that when one person's poor, we're all poor, right? And when racism exists for one, it's gonna exist. It can't just exist in a vacuum. And I think too often we have talked about these systems and things not being able to change, but we're all individual and we all can start where we are. Even your platform, you have influence. And if you sat here and told people, like Amanda, like stop talking to your dad like that. You should respect him. You don't take that from him. He's right, and it's like there's no one gains from that. And we still stay stuck in these systems that perpetuate over and over the same message. Um, Particularly now when we know that we didn't learn these things, and the way in which we learned it was from one side. I mean, there's lots of even with the Confederacy, right, John? Like, what are you thinking about the monuments?
Yeah. Growing up, we saw the Confederate flag everywhere. There, it was just a symbol of the South to me until I actually learned a lot more about the the history of um, states' rights and what they were fighting for and that sort of thing. And it just made it seem so obvious that that should not have, be promoted in any way, shape, or form. So obviously, I got rid of everything that had Confederacy on it. But that was my decision. But as a state or as an educated governor, or I just can't see that being promoted. Whether you're a military leader, whether you're a governor, or even a congressman, it just seems like that would be um, an automatic thing that you would want to take out of your sick history. You know what I mean?
Well, and I also think, right, people have talked about open a museum, and then people go and pay to go watch, look at those things. But right now, I think what also to keep your eye on too is now there's conversation about if you take them down, then you're erasing history. And I don't know, I think that's another way to kind of shut the conversation down and to shut down progress because um, Mississippi, I think, as of last week, are gonna they taking off the Confederacy off their flag that's been there for millions of years. The
A
governor,
hundred, a
what was
hundred
that?
plus years.
Yeah, yeah. And then the governor of that state, I believe, is related to Carol Bryant, who was the woman who said that Emmett Till had come on to her, whatever it was. And so even his history, if you've seeked out any of his or heard any of his, he's got a speech that he gives when he the signs it out of signs I guess, to retire the state or the flag or what have you, whatever that language is. And he is on record from a couple of years ago saying that he thought the flag, there was nothing wrong with it, and that it was up to the people to decide if it should come down. And now here we are, we're at that place where he was talking about. And even then, his speech was troublesome because he was still really swarmy in his words about what the Confederacy meant. And
Mhm.
so, I would say to you and to your listeners, like, the just keeping and paying attention. There's so many things to pay attention to. I don't think you have to know everything because you won't, and I won't. But those big key things that we're watching, where people are still out here fighting for rights. Breonna Taylor. You've probably seen a lot of those memes that are going around about um, the police officers who murdered her, and they're calling for their arrest. I think one of them was fired, and we now know in previous years that police officers just being fired isn't enough because they move around, right? Like,
Yeah, they don't take away their certification. So if you're fired from one place, they will hire you in another. Like King County deputy sheriffs will hire anybody because they're so desperate for that position because they're paid less than most other counties. And then you go to the Washington State Troopers, and they're even paid less. So if you get paid, if you're a city employee like where I live in Puyallup,
yeah,
um, you're probably one of the most highest paid police officers or law enforcement officers there is. But if you go to the county and the state, then you get paid less. So they move them around, and then if you're 5 or 10 years clean, then you get hired back with different cities, and that's the I think the most basic thing that people don't understand because of the police union. It's kind of like the teachers union or any other union. They're or the NRA, for example. And I'm a total gun freak, so please don't get me started on guns. But it's the same concept. If you are so money supported, they're not gonna. It's harder to make movement there. So just to let you know.
well, and I think, right, they're talking about defunding the police. I believe LA, Los Angeles, California has said that they will uh, take away so much. And then in Minneapolis, the city council is talking about defunding. So I think that's also, when that first I think that's been introduced maybe the last few weeks, because remember, John, it's been about a lot about reform, police reform. And like you talked about earlier, the consent decrees, right? That um, Seattle was sanctioned and they had to clean up their act. And remember, there were, gosh, who was the chief of police? It was an acting male, and then
Yeah, he
O'Toole.
was a lieutenant, but now there's um, a black woman that's been in charge for about 5 or 6 years, and she's done as much as she can considering the mayor that we have.
I don't think it's been that long. It hasn't been that. Carmen Best is her name. I don't know that
Yeah.
she. I before her was Catherine O'Toole, and you remember her. She was like the interim, I believe, and then something happened. Whether she didn't, I don't think she got hired because if you recall, maybe it has been 5 years. Remember, there was a kind of a big panel, and there were lots of folks coming from different areas. Carmen Best had been a police officer for like 20 something years or something like
Hmm.
that. And
Yeah, she was from the East Precinct.
oh, okay, East. Okay, so she'd been around. I want to say her career spanned like over 20 years. I mean, and even when we look at, while she's the police, but using that as an example, that
28 years.
28 years
She
before
doesn't
being
look 28 years old sometimes.
to be recognized, to then be promoted, and then to take over. I mean, for her to take over such a big I mean, in the Chop and Chat, or Chaz is now Chop, and I now think Chop is now being,
Gone. Yeah, it's
yeah,
totally gone.
right. So even thinking about that, like her whole having to come in and to then monitor that. I think another thing for you and your listeners is if you look around the country, there are a lot more black folks that you'll see in like mayoral roles. Um, they're in higher positions.
Yeah,
And I think that is, as we see the representation, the system is still racist. So even these folks are working within that system, they're still being kind of pushed back. There's still a barrier that exists, even though they are told to be that they're in the lead or they're the leadership. So I think being able to pay attention to like where you work and where you live. If you're only seeing people like yourself,
yeah, yeah. I just came through a situation this year where my black manager was fired, and um, two, maybe even three people had left that were black, and now only people that are hired have been white, and it's like red flag, red flag, red flag. There is no way that you can't tell me that there isn't somebody that is qualified to do this job. It's just not. It's not even a possibility. So
and working for corporate, right? To see the, like you said, your black manager leave or fired or quit or whatever. A lot of times, right? There's a push out. You pushed out. You don't necessarily come to the firing yet because
no warning, nothing, just bam, gone.
the pressure of being a certain way or acting a certain way in which you're respected or respectability, right? Even in those settings, though, being able to challenge, like, because the thing that comes back is, oh, it's privacy. We can't tell you what happened, right? That's all. That's just between me and the employee. And you're like, yeah, but as my boss, I didn't see, and didn't feel what was the threat, what was the problem. So I think like your voice being able to say, I'm seeing this happen. What's the plan to get back diversity? Or what's the plan to bring back folks who are skilled, who need jobs, who also need to pay their bills? How do we take care of them? Because even in a lot of work settings, it's who you know. And a lot of that's like, oh, yeah, I've known John. We shop at the same grocery store. You look like a good guy. There's that nice thing again. Come on down and we'll get you a job, right?
Yeah,
And
it's
we'll help.
funny. Nina just put in the chat that they should do blind interviews. you know, I think about that, being that we talked about interviews. They do this on those cooking shows where they actually watch what they're cooking, the judges, and it's like you should never do that. You should always taste it without seeing how it's made, right? You don't want to know how the sausage is made. You just want to make sure the sausage is good, which is the same thing. If I test you on Excel or Outlook or some performance, then that's what you should use as a qualification, not do you dress well or do you smell good or are you black, obviously.
Well, and I think that also gets rooted in the fact that if we're talking about inequities, right? And I was listening to um, an actor who is a black male, and his name escapes me, but he was saying a lot of folks, how they hire even for those things, that that they're not necessarily training black folks or people of color to take in those positions. And so he was, I think now, because a lot of us are being asked, like, well, what do you think should happen? And I think there's still a nervousness that we're feeling because we're like, well, by all means, I would like to be considered, and not so much now to where you're now asking me every step of the way in which you should be decent to me. You know, how do you justify that folks are not being afforded the same um, opportunities? like you're saying, everybody now that's being hired after these folks have left, those folks leaving left a hole. And you can fill them up with as many as white employees as you like, but that still will not serve the same purpose. It won't have the same look. Um,
Can I get your perspective on CHOP since we mentioned that earlier? So just to let you know, that's a small area in downtown Seattle, probably what, 6 blocks, 5, 6 blocks from where we used to work.
yep, not far at all.
No, and very popular area as far as having parades all the way up Broadway. So right across the street from the thrift shop that was a famous song called Thrift Shop. I forget who's the guy that sang
Oh,
that.
yeah, the rapper.
Yeah. Anyways,
Yeah,
sorry, I get distracted.
yeah. No,
But
no, no.
yeah,
But now I'm like, what's his name? Ugh, go ahead.
yeah, we'll find out real quick. But so
Macklemore.
who's saying yes, Macklemore. So he's obviously in that area a lot, and the East Precinct is right there on the corner. So obviously, people put a lot of time into protesting right where the police department was, and caused so much disruption. They were able to block off that area, as you know, which I don't know how the mayor actually agreed to it, because usually they'll go to Westlake Center, right, where it's literally in the commercial district, as opposed to more of a residential suburban area of downtown Seattle. Um, and they'll protest there. So I'm not sure why our mayor did that, but she allowed them to block that off.
And I want to say when it first started, I think she was supportive, and then
Oh
there,
no, she is definitely supportive
there was a
until
shooting. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, until there was murder. Yeah, absolutely.
And even then, I thought I saw and I read that the shooting that took place, it was a part of the white supremacist group. Um, and the claim that the police weren't able to get in. There's that's where there's some conflicting stories, because the East Precinct, when the police officers left, I had read that they should have not left their post, and I think Carmen Best, their chief, said, "Why did you leave your post?" And so then once they were out, right, they couldn't come back in, because I think probably part of ego, and also as we noticed, because remember, just a couple of weeks ago, through or so, Rayshard Brooks was killed in Atlanta, and remember, right after that, the police officers in that area and around the country started calling in sick, um, and and so there's this question of, now all of a sudden the people supposedly have this power, and then there was like, well, if you need to call the police, because this is another conversation where you could be helpful, and your listeners as well, when you hear that person say, well, what happens if someone breaks into my house? And while if someone breaks into my house, I want to call the police too. I want them to be there too. I don't No one is saying that the police should go away. You also mentioned being a gun enthusiast, and no one's saying you to throw your guns away, but you gotta be smart about it. And I think right now what's happening is people are saying the police don't. We need to give money to other areas. Why should a police officer be responsible for responding to someone who has a mental illness?
Sure.
Why should police officers have to make that choice to have a dispute where they're not they're not needed? And I think right now police, especially with the fear factor of being afraid, why not give them relief and allow them to do the job that they've signed up for, as opposed, protecting and serving, as opposed to being a brutal, being a brutal member of the community, and wreaking more havoc. So that CHOP situation was very controversial, right? Because the folks who went down there said there's predominantly white folks here, and Capitol Hill is known for its eclectic history, but now the way Capitol Hill looks, compared to what it looked 10 years ago, there's all this real estate. People are buying really small places for very lots of money. There's Google and Amazon and all the places that are able to afford to live in these areas. So I think CHOP, it was definitely a protest in which said we're going to inhibit this space. It was filled with artistic work. I understand it was filled with speakers, people sharing I guess people were giving out food, and there was just it was a comfortable place for people to
Yep.
be around each other. And the moment
Peace,
that
peacefully.
peacefully, yeah,
Yeah.
in the moment that was in question, and I'm almost certain too, where I feel like there's this thought that if it's peaceful, no one wants. It's like there's this idea of like, well, let's interrupt the peace and see what we get, and then when you get the response, then that becomes the bigger part. I think even when people were saying, I saw a video where it's in Shreveport, Louisiana, where I'm not in Shreveport, but I'm in Louisiana, and there's a video in which there must have been some protest, and a group of black males showed up with guns, and they had their gun on their holster, they had a rifle around their necks, and they were there to protect. And they said, there's been such an intimidation by the other group, and the young man spoke very eloquently. He said, so when the first group was here, which were white men with guns, there was no problem. Now I'm here, and now you're questioning why we're here. And it's like that's where I think, John, you and your listeners become helpful, because it's like, all right, let's continue this conversation. Why are we focused on that? Why weren't we there at the beginning? And even though we weren't there at the beginning, we're here now. Why are we questioning their right to have guns, their right to be assembled? Um, so I think, starting where you feel most comfortable, like what Amanda said with her father, depending on her relationship, she was able to say to him, dad, or however she called him. Maybe she didn't say dad. She called him other names and said, listen, you got to listen to what I'm saying, if this is not okay. And,
Yeah, it's really hard to do sometimes because I have experienced that myself, um, where I intentionally bring up this conversation, and they're like, well, they're just gonna tear down the stores or burn the stores or burn commercial property. Or I'm like, if your wife was killed the way that George Floyd was killed, I'd be the first one burning stuff too. And they don't understand that feeling. They've never experienced it. But to experience it, 5 or 10 times every month, it's like every time you turn around, you're adding to the fire. And I just don't understand how. I bring up, I I have a small Bible study, and I talk about, Jesus turned over the money changing tables. Even Jesus, was protesting in a way, violently and destructively, and they don't see it the same. It's amazing how myopic people are in regards to that. The United States, the Boston Tea Party, we pretended to be Native Americans and destroyed British property. I'm sorry, that's the same. There is no different. There's no different. And
what,
I just go ahead.
what do you think of the Washington team, the football Redskins, that name?
Oh my gosh, it's so frustrating to be 2020 and we're still calling them the Redskins. And I think Daniel's like on his way to changing it, but it's been 50 years in the making. I mean, I don't understand how that's allowed
And
by the commissioner, by the president.
and even the article that I read just a couple days ago said that they're going to review it and think about it. And so that's so John, that's where we are right now, where it's like, what are we reviewing? Like that's where your listeners come in hand and going, we don't need to review anything. Like, why are we wasting more time? Because it creates the space to continue to stall, to dismantle it. If we're truly going to be real about dismantling, like if we're going to be honest, like you contacted me and said, hey, you know, come on my live stream. Let's talk about this, right? And I remember I questioned, like, okay, what are we going to talk about? Because I don't want to come in and, we still have this, well, the monuments and the street name changes and the school name changes and all the places, like where I live, it's Jefferson Parish. Well, Thomas, think about Thomas Jefferson, right? Like, what are we reviewing? What more do we need to talk about? Why are we still stalling? Because what, we can't find another better name? That's ludicrous. Like that's bogus. We know that that's BS. So I think, going back to what you're saying, what you do now, there's a plethora of things you can do. I would also encourage your folks out there to not necessarily expect that change is going to happen now because you've jumped in. I mean, I think it's great that folks are more focused. And I'm reading. If you think about the deaths between George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks, there was a few weeks in between, and most of the Black community, the folks that I talked to, were like, "Gosh, the police are still like they are being watched, and yet they still shot a man in the back, right?" And it's like, as a Black community, we are not shocked and surprised. And as a white community, I say, get rid of your vocabulary of saying we're still here. Like, we never left.
Right.
Like, the country is like, we've never left, and we are not going to leave. And I know that there's talk about how the population is going to change in terms of race and the birth rates and the death rates and this and that. And I think people get caught in those weeds. But I think as soon as we hear someone say, I'm speaking for the voiceless, and and I was right after when Rayshard Brooks was killed, I read after a protester was upset saying, we've been out here for a couple of weeks already. Why did that happen? And you're like, well, because it's still a racist society. And we still need more people to say, you know what, police officers, that is the immunity. That's another thing that's up, right? The police officers, it was just what, a couple, maybe a week or two ago, where they're talking about removing, the reform bill, not the reform bill, the bill that's in, that was it passed by the police reform bill that they're trying to pass? In the language in there talks about immunity where police officers cannot kill people and then still be okay, which we've seen in the previous years where they've been able to be on desk administration.
Yeah, they always have this. A lot of people don't know this, but they have where they question people that demand their rights, and they call them sovereign citizens, when the police themselves are sovereign from the crimes that they commit because they're doing it in the act of performing their job. Well, nobody else has the same privilege as that, and that is beyond a privilege. It's ridiculous.
So they're trying to take that language out so that when that occurs, you'll see the swift action as opposed to this long lag time. So, again, I think paying attention to those types of things that are happening, um, following and amplifying Black folks, and really listening, because right now I think also we can be lulled into, um, I don't want to say her name, but I'm sure people are familiar. Last name Owens, first name starts with a C. And this one woman who is younger than I am, who probably could have a lot in common in terms of working, moving in this country, has decided to stay on the side of history that says there's no racism. And, show me a Black person and I will show you the things that they've done wrong, right? And so there's a lull of feeling like, oh, there's no racism, there's nothing wrong, and if it occurs, it's only a one-off. And I think that's where you say, no, we can no longer accept that. It's not a one-off. So
Someone told me the other day they don't have to choose a side, and I almost came out of my head, literally. I'm like, you just saw a man being murdered slowly, and you don't see anything wrong with that? That's just the saddest thing I think I've ever heard in my life. And I'm still debating on how to productively make that change. You know what I mean?
The moment you hear, because this is another language I think that people use, you must hate all white people. I just had that said to me not that long ago. And it was like, if you follow, or any of your folks probably are familiar with Jane Elliott, she's been around. She's 86-year-old woman. She did the blue eye, brown eye exercise in her third grade class. Not many people have heard of her because, I mean, her history, I think she's on the right side of history, so why would we amplify that? But,
Right, right.
you know, I don't know the year, but it was many, many years. I want to say at least 50 years ago, maybe, because she's been an educator for now 52 years. And so she does this exercise where she tells the blue-eyed children in her classroom that they are less than, and that they're done. She kind of just perpetuates the language in which she saw racism exist. And this is she conducted this right after Martin Luther King was murdered. And I've seen her in a recent interview where she still tears up because she thought so highly of what he was doing, and when he was murdered, that impacted her in a very particular way. So she went home. She thought of this exercise. She went back to school, and she worked with her third grade class. And I think she did the exercise for maybe a couple of days because she saw how quickly it was brown eyed children were of privilege, and they were able to tell the blue eyed kids, well, you're just this, you're dumb, and whatever. And she saw how they were not treated very, they weren't treated decent. And when she called attention to it in the town that she was from, I want to say she's from the Midwest, the people in the town were so upset that her family owned a business and they lost business, and it carried forward. And I think for her, she describes um, race being a construct. I think that's another way to stall the conversation. That says we're not really white, we're not really black, it's all made up. um, but Jane Elliott does this thing in her speeches where she says, all right, if okay, black folks, stand up if you hate all white people. And then, maybe one person stands up, and then the people are like, see, and then they're like, she's like, actually, let me ask you this. How many of you want to get back at 1 to 2 white people? And then the whole crowd stands up because they're like, oh yeah, I remember this when this happened to me, right? And so she just illustrates it's not the whole group, um, and it's not a one-off. And so I think what I'll say and ask you to do is pay attention to language. And I think the times where we challenge each other, when we say things like black on black crime, that's another, lightning rod that's supposed to spark some things out. Anytime we start getting into the weeds about the statistics of who gets killed most by police, that's not helpful. Um, Nor does it change the way in which the optics of it all. So, being alert and not allowing for folks to just kind of rest on their laurels. I think we've done that for too long.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest point that I've learned is that we've seen it, we acknowledge it, but what the hell have we been doing about it? And I think that's where I'm at in regards to let's get that thing rolling down the hill, because once we get the momentum and, you know, in all seriousness, Black Lives Matter can protest until the day the earth is done. And I don't think we're going to have as much effect as having people that are white, quote unquote, privileged or whatever, make that change, whether it's through men, women, or families or what have you. They've got to start making efforts into influencing people that are decision makers, whether it be the police or um, even just changing. I get so frustrated with the prison system because that's a perfect statistic to show we're freaking prejudiced systemically, no matter how you look at it, because there's no way that all of the people that are in prison are criminals in regards to the population percentage. You can't tell me 100% of the black people are guilty of those crimes. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, and I think too, you make a great point because Jim Crow, the new, and it's talked like prison is kind of being utilized in that way, right? Where, like you said, there's a man in North Carolina right now. His name is Ronnie Long, and he's now in his 60s. I think when he was 19, he was accused of rape, and they've since figured out he was not the rapist, and he still sits in jail. Uh, and even there's been light shined on people saying he shouldn't still be there, and he's
Sure,
still sitting there. So, the prison where we see folks come out who have sat for 30 plus years, and black men and women where they didn't commit these crimes, but, you know, goes back to policing. The detectives found some witnesses and roughed them up and said, you better come and say that this person did it. And then we find out that the person wasn't even there. They knew nothing. They were coerced, and then it just continues. And so even when you think about prison, the population, think about how they are they are added into the population in terms of taxes that the state receives, and there's still a money. The people are making money from these folks being imprisoned.
sure, sure.
People are definitely not getting the rewards of their presence. They're being counted, but not being utilized in a way in which they should as human beings. So, even when you think about folks that are in prison, they come out and they go back in, and the recidivism rate, they're not being trained. There's also, I don't know if you've seen this, where in California they were teaching folks that were in prison to code. So when they get out, they would, because
Tough
they
job.
come out, yeah, because a lot of places don't want to hire folks because of their record. You
Sure.
know, I even think about there's so much to dismantle when you think about job applications. Why are you asking about race and ethnicity if you're not going to hire if you're not going to hire anybody other than white folks, right? Why ask that question?
Exactly.
And so I think when you think about folks who leave out of prison, they have no training. It's pretty obvious that they will be put back where they were. I have a cousin who has spent the better part of 20 years of his life in and out of prison. And as a black male, he he's been through so much in terms of even if you look at the number of prison people who are in prison and the number of people who are on probation and the amount of money you have to have in order to be on probation. You have to have a job and you have to have this but no one helps you to do that. And even that, there's double the amount of people on probation still who are that are in prison. Um, so it's a money making scheme. I think if we are honest and we recognize how this country has grown and been promoted on the backs of black folks and slave and cheap labor, you think about immigration. Even when folks, John, were saying, "Oh, those Mexican people are going to come and take our jobs," no one was challenging them. Like, well, then go out there and get the jobs, right?
Exactly. Nobody wants those jobs. Trust me, especially
So,
here in Washington.
and we now know there's even people who are hiring, the folks that are not here that are supposed to be, right? And they're then paying them very, and I don't say shouldn't supposed to be. I want to change that because I can't know who should be here and who shouldn't.
Right, right.
Um, and I think that's also part of the language of the same folks who are like, you don't belong here, are the same folks who are like, come over here and I'll pay you $3.10, and you work 24 hours in a row. Going back to what you said, all the things we know, what to do forward, and I think just recognizing that a lot of this isn't going to change in our lifetime. But like you said, with the person who said, "What side do I have to? I don't have to choose a side." Like they're not gonna. Those types of people, I know as I'm getting older, I can't spend my time worrying about because if I do, it can be pretty disheartening
Frustrating,
and
frustrating. Yeah.
discouraging. And you're like, okay, nothing will ever change.
Then
I
you'll
mean,
be an angry white man. Uh, well, I know that we've been on for a long time, and I definitely want to say thank you very much for being here. I do want to say, what, if you could leave us with one hint in regards to, because I know you're a family counselor, you definitely work with people that have issues. What are some of the ways that we can, as a society, whether we're black, white, or men, women, gay or straight, whatever, how can we move forward? What was one thing that you would recommend besides challenge? Because I heard you say that challenge.
um, I I think for individually, because I've been doing this too in the last few weeks, of just really thinking about mm, how I have either contributed to white supremacy myself, right? That I'm not immune to, being in a room full of people and staying quiet because I thought that's what I should do. Um, I think the responsibility for us to have more awareness where we didn't before and where we didn't have to. Um, I think it's a lot of different steps. I don't want to leave just one because I think there's so many things, and I don't want to paint. I don't want to paint a broad stroke and then decide that that's what everyone should do. I
So
think
that's you admitting you're going to come back and give us a bunch more.
sure. I will say this: it's got to be something that's going to be sustainable. It's got to be something that is going to make you want to do it. And I don't know if there are people in your life that you recognize that need your attention, that need your guidance, that need your support. And you may need support too. I feel like right now we're at a time where will this be a moment or will this be a movement? I think we've got momentum, and hopefully people don't stall and they continue to move forward. And and I know this is what we all know. You can send emails to your folks in your state, your governor, your local police department, your senators, congressmen, your representatives. You can make phone calls. Um, I know it feels fleeting and it's like a running water where we just can't stop the leak. Um, and I think we have to kind of take in our minds and think and realize that this is ongoing. There have been gains, but really the gains that we thought were there, who actually benefited from those? And if we're honest, I think if we slow down, like the pandemic has showed us, for some anyway, that showing up for others matters, but I think even more so showing up for yourself and how you want to be perceived and how you want to see yourself when you look in the mirror. I know that seems so simple. Remember this, John. On the floors of you would walk down on the floors at work, and remember those pictures that would be like if uh, don't do this if you don't want to show up on the front page of the newspaper, and like pictures of the iceberg that said that like this is just the tip. They were all these like kind of motivational
Sure, sure.
pictures, and they were to promote you to act with integrity, right? um and like when no one's watching, how are you going to respond? And I
Be
think,
intentional, right?
right, so I think being intentional, even for folks who are not necessarily feeling that they're racist, which is great, then don't turn it around and say, I don't know why I'm not racist, or I don't know why I think the way I do, because you have intention. There's a reason that you feel this way that you do. So be intentional. I'm not, John, you're not going to think this way because you talked about your grandfather. You know the harm it caused and causes. So you don't want to inflict any more harm. Then be be okay with that. I'm choosing not to inflict any more harm. So this is what I'm going to not do anymore, or do, be proud of being anti-racist, and keep learning and staying open-minded.
I'm going to say my one thing that I would encourage you to do is literally intentionally go out and find someone that you're not friends with and try to be friends with them, whether it's um, a coworker or someone down the street. Either, I'm not saying invite them to dinner, make them the most special guest or whatever, but just be friendly, make them your friend. Obviously this is a tougher time to do that, but make an effort, I guess, is the best way to put it. There's so many people that would want you to. You probably couldn't speak to this. If I did that to you, like I invited you to this live stream, that probably made a, an impression on you as far as what you thought of me in regards to our of race relations. Would you say?
Yes, and I will say this. My initial thought, first of all, I had to say, okay, I remember John. Second of all, I had to also think I was suspicious. And I think what I would say to your listeners, to your followers, is that don't be discouraged if you come across a black person or person of color who is not cheering you on because you said hello to them, or not cheering you on because you offered something that right now, especially in these times, it's you want to be safe, and there's so much going on in terms of violence right now. So I would say, give as your followers, give yourself grace, give yourself time to be okay and walk away if someone rejects you being kind, and not to take that personal, because right now I don't know you. So if John, you approached me on the corner and I'm just seeing you for the first time, I may be a little bit shy about why you're providing me attention and with vigor, right? And so I think being able, as a person who is trying to dismantle, being okay with the fact that when you walk away, it may not be what you intended, and also recognizing that your intention does not always mean impact. The impact on that can be negative. So if your intention's there of, of wanting to be decent towards each other, um, you've just got to continue, and it will be a ripple effect. It will
So
be.
I shouldn't stalk you on Instagram anymore? Is that what you're saying?
No, keep doing that, and share.
That's awesome.
But yeah, thank you. Listen, John, I appreciate this, and I hope to be invited back. I think that the what's big is that this is ongoing. It's not a one conversation, a one and done. It can't be a one stop shop. It's got to be just, we've got to keep going. And I can tell you, as a black woman, I'm tired and I'm exhausted. And I just hope that folks can see that it's time for others to step up. It really is.
Amen to that. Sounds great. Well, I hope you all have a great 4th of July. Thank you so much for being here. There's so many people that have been here all day. Santa Mia Major, Lady Starfall, Laura D. I'm so hopeful that you're going to get better, and we're going to be talking about this for a long time and be on the other side. Katrin C., always fun to talk to you and listen to your Sansa videos. Thunderclap, Warrior Girl 113, Jay Sean Vlogs, Apparently Human. Callum was here. That's awesome. So glad to see you. Jay Sean's new from Ohio. He's in Seattle now and does videos, so I get to see him. Very cool. Amanda, the Fearless Mermaid, obviously been around since the minute one, actually before we got on, I think. Mrs. Duncan the Tall. I know I'm missing somebody. I'm so sorry. Icy Spots was here earlier. Oh my gosh, so many people. Al, Red Sox fan, stopped in. Thanks for being here. Yeah, so many people came by and gave their support, so I really appreciate it. Hope everybody has a great holiday. Stay safe. Wear your mask if you're going outside. Wash your hands, for God's sakes. And be nice to someone. We'll talk to you later.